Well, there is a song that we all sing at Christmas, I think that you guys know. It is called, "It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year." You guys know this song? A couple of you? It's a wonderful time of the year? Right. So I want to know this morning, how many of you think that this is the most wonderful time of the year? Maurice, yes. Yeah. So why? Tell me why do you think? This is not a trick question, not anything like that, just genuinely asking. Why do you think it's the most wonderful time of the year? It's what? It's his birthday. All right, what else? Jesus' birthday, right. Jesus and Maurice, right there, just like that. Well, let me ask you this question. Who in here thinks or has a difficulty in saying this is the most wonderful time of the year? Is it a struggle? It is. It's hard sometimes. Now, I heard a story this week about a young couple, and I want to share that this morning. They had a tradition in their family, and the tradition in their family went like this. Him and his wife and their kids would go over to his dad's house on Christmas Eve, and they would have Christmas Eve with his mom and dad or whatever, and then they'd leave late and go over to her parents that night, spend the night, and do Christmas morning with her parents. That was sort of their tradition in their family. The tradition in my family with us is that we used to go to West Virginia for Christmas, and we would stay in North Carolina or go to North Carolina when we were living in Chicago. We'd go to North Carolina for Thanksgiving. Then the following year, we would flip. We'd go to vice versa, whatever. We'd stay in North Carolina for Christmas and West Virginia for Thanksgiving so that we could spend time with the family. Well, that worked okay until Hannah was born, and then, we were still trying to track her around on airplanes and stuff like that. And as she got a little older, we sort of made some changes and said, well, we'd probably stay at home for Christmas. And so for years and years and years, we traveled to West Virginia for Thanksgiving. We stay at home for Christmas, and then this year we're talking about maybe make some more changes as life goes, but there's always, a lot of emotion in that, right? You guys have this struggle. You go into this person's house, and how long do you stay? And you go to that person's house, and should you go over there? Should I not go over there? Should I stay over there? What is the right thing to do? And a lot of marriages, we have a struggle. It's like, oh, well, I go to my parents, I go to my parents. This is, we struggle with this. Well, here's what was happening with this young couple, okay? They had this problem this one Christmas. The husband's mom and dad had got separated. So what was going to happen is that his dad was living at his house by himself. So if he went over to his dad's house for Christmas Eve, and then they left like they normally did and goes over to his wife's family's house, then his dad would spend Christmas morning all by himself. So that bothered him. He's like, man, I really feel bad leaving my dad all by himself to go over there. And I'm wondering what should I stay with my dad? Should I put my wife's family off? Like, what is the right thing to do? Have anybody in here been in any similar situations? Yeah, like most of us, you're trying to figure out kind of what to do, what we should do. Well, this particular guy was pretty smart, and he had a friend. So he reached out to this friend to ask him his advice. I've talked about this a lot before, that we need to have Christian brothers and sisters that we reach out to. This is why community is important. When we have a problem in our life, we need to have someone we can pick up the phone and call and say, I've got an issue. Now, women don't have a problem as much as men do asking advice from other people. So guys, you need to, I've said it before over and over, you need to find another guy in your life that you can share life with. We all have experiences that we can sort of help one another out with. It's why community is so important, especially in the church. So he reaches out to his friend and he told him the situation. He said, here's the deal. This is what's going on with my dad and my mom. Not sure what I'm supposed to do. It's next week. Help me out. So his friend said, well, I'll help you out by telling you a story. So his friend told him a story. He said, early on in our marriage, that him and his wife had gotten all dressed up. They were all fancied up, and they were going out to eat for their anniversary. They were going to celebrate their anniversary together. And just as they were getting ready to leave to go out to eat, this guy's mom called. It's really hot up here. So this guy's mom's called and said, hey, your dad is having another episode. Can you come over? Well, here's what was going on. His dad was a World War II vet, and after he finished fighting the war overseas, he came home and had to fight another war of his own, which we see a lot of that with these guys who fight in the wars and stuff. So he came home and he had these problems he had had for years. So his mom said, you need to come over here and help me. So this guy, what he decided to do was, my dad needs me. He left his wife and he went over to help his dad. And what he told his friend is he said, here's what I did. I left to go fix a 40-year-old problem that I could never fix. And in doing so, I created a whole nother problem back at my house. So here's what he told his friend to do. You need to go to your dad's house. You need to enjoy Christmas Eve with him. You need to pack up that beautiful family of yours. And just like you always do, you need to go over to your wife's family just like you always do. And for many of us, for many of you guys, Christmas is not the most wonderful time of year because what is happening? It's coming up slowly. There it is. Happening. It's not the most wonderful time of year because what is happening. And here's what's happening many times. Problems we can't solve, people we can't control, and expectations that we can't meet. And everybody's thinking, amen. That's it. But here's the other problem. If you can look at yourself and you can look in the mirror, then you may realize that I'm the problem that I can't solve. I'm the person I can't control, or I have expectations that I can't meet. It's not always the other people. Sometimes we're the problem. And it's not the most wonderful time of the year because what is happening around us. But it is the most wonderful time of the year because of what has happened, okay? And when we celebrate Christmas, we are celebrating an event that set in motion a series of events that changed the world. God sent Jesus to be the center of history. And if you've been reading the Bible just for a little while, or maybe you hadn't picked it up in a while, or maybe you're new to the Bible, you think the Bible is just a kind of a conglomeration of really cool stories, and it is that, but it's more than that. It's history. And God sent Jesus to be the center of history, but more importantly, God sent Jesus to be the center of my life and to be the center of your life. He did. And when Jesus becomes the center of my life and he becomes the center of your life, then he centers our life around something stable, on something hopeful, on something that gives us a purpose and a reason to get up every day. When Christmas is not the most wonderful time of the year, it's because we're worried and we're fearful about the people and all the things that are happening around us. It's not the most wonderful time of the year because of who is with us. The family, the friends, and all. That's what makes it miserable for us. When Christmas is the most wonderful time of the year, it's because we know who, it's not about just who is with us, it's about who is for us. That's why Jesus came. When life gets darker and more complicated and more confusing and the decisions start getting more and more difficult at Christmas, see, everything gets exaggerated because it's all of those people together in the same room. The same time, the time period and all. But at Christmas, we're reminded that we celebrate that a light has come in the world to make an incredible difference in your life and my life. That's why Jesus came. Now, we talked about this in a recent series about the birth of Jesus and what it looked like in each one of the Gospels. The Gospels are the 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, they tell a very similar story to the birth of Jesus. John tells a little bit different story of Jesus. It's not different in that it doesn't go along with it or it's saying something totally different that doesn't line up with the Gospels. It's just a different version that John tells than the other ones. The biggest difference in John's story than the other gospel, it's when he wrote it. John actually wrote his gospel story when he was a very old man. And he sat down at an old age and he wrote the story of Jesus. Now, historians believe that Mark was the very first gospel to be written. The reason that they think this is because the other gospels have in them what Mark said. So they think that Mark wrote his first. The other guys said, hey, that's a pretty good idea like that. He wrote all this down. And they kind of used this as a template and sort of went off of that and told some of the same stories that Mark wrote. But so what's in Mark is in the other gospels, but what's in the other gospels is not necessarily in Mark. And that's why they think that. They think that his was the first book. Now, we don't know this either, but they think that John was actually the very last gospel that was written. And so what you can imagine is that John sits down at a very old age. and he just sits down kind of tired, you know? And he says, I've been telling these stories for a long time to a lot of people. I mean, John told these stories to everybody. This has been passed down, and he says, I don't have a lot of time left. And I really need to write down my stories and my version of what I saw and what I know about Jesus. Now, we know that he told these stories because he's talked about in the book of Acts, and then Paul talks about him. He actually describes John as being a pillar of the early church. So we know that people living during this period of time, they all heard John's stories. Here's what Paul says about John in Galatians 2. And when James and Cephas, that was Peter, and John, who seemed to be pillars, there's what he says, when they perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised. Only they ask us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. Now, if you grew up in church in the South like I did, this is where I assume that joke used to come from. When the old guys would see some kid in church misbehaving, and they would say, let me tell you what, that kid right there, he needs the right hand of fellowship given to him. You know what I'm saying? Has nothing to do with what I'm talking about today. I just thought that was funny. All right. The right hand of fellowship. That's funny. But John was a pillar of the early church because of the stories that he told about how important he was in this life of Jesus. So he decides that he's going to write these down at a very old age. And this is why it's important, okay? John has seen loss and he's experienced pain in his life that nobody in this room has ever experienced. You've never experienced pain like he has, and you never will, thank God. But John knows darkness like nobody in this room knows, okay? He has seen his best friend, his beloved, Jesus. He saw him die. And not just like he went over there and Jesus died unexpectedly. It wasn't that Jesus came down with a disease and he watched him die in a hospital bed over years. What he saw happen to Jesus was that he was tortured to death right in front of him. He was beaten so bad that you couldn't even recognize who he was. And then John was standing there helpless as Jesus was hanging on a cross, bleeding and suffocating to death. And he was standing there with Jesus' mom. And then he watched Jesus do what Jesus does best in that moment, and he turns and looks at the thief beside him, and he says, today you'll be with me in paradise, because everything about Jesus was salvation for all of us human beings. He's lost all of his beloved friends to terrible, terrible torture. He heard about Paul and Peter and all these brutal deaths. He has experienced loss like no one that you've ever met. He sees his life, he sees his friends. He actually saw pretty much his whole culture, the whole Jewish nation, kind of go away in his lifetime. And John sits down at an old age, tired, and he describes God in one word: love. Isn't that amazing? Love. Because John was alive when Nero came through and he slaughtered all of the Jewish people and he sent thousands of them into slavery. He watched, some people believe that he was actually in the city of Jerusalem when this guy named Vespasian came through, and he tried to go into the city and he couldn't get in, and so he said, we'll just starve them to death. And they stayed outside, didn't let anybody in, and thousands of Jews starved to death, and many of them died of diseases. He was alive when they burned the temple to the ground in about 70 AD. He loses his friends, he loses his family, his culture, everything he loves, and he never loses his faith. And at the very end of his book, here's what he says in John 20, verse 30. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. What he's saying is, listen, I've written a lot of stuff down, and it's not all of it. It's just a glimpse. I don't have enough paper and pen or time left in my life to write down everything that I saw Jesus Christ do in my lifetime. This is just a glimpse. And he says this in verse 31, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. He says, the reason that I'm writing this, it's not just to have some good stories. The reason I'm writing all of this down is so that you can believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. He is the Son of God, and by believing that you may have life. Not just a physical life. Everybody reading this has a physical life. He says it's so much more. It's another life. It's a spiritual life. It gives you hope. There's something better in this life than living and dying. I'm an old man. I've seen incredible darkness. Terrible things happen to everything. And I'm telling you, this man Jesus, everything about him is life. And you can have that purpose if you believe in his name. And after all that John has experienced and all that after he has seen the loss of all of his friends, his nation, everything he has and everyone he loves, he still believes at the very end of his life, seeing all that, he still believes that faith in Jesus Christ means something more. It still means something more. All the death that he's seen, he still believes, and he wants you to believe that in spite of this, he describes God as love and as life. Amazing. Do you remember when Jesus was dying on the cross and he looked down and John was there and he says to him about his mom, take care of my mom. John, this is your mother, take care of her. And so John did. Some people think that John stayed with Mary her whole life. I'm not sure about that, but that's some people think that. But at least we know that he cared for her for a very long time, that he was very close to her. John and Mary had a very close relationship for sure. So no one else but John would have had the amount of time he did with Mary to ask him about the birth of Jesus. He could have asked Mary, what was it like to have the angel visit you? What was it like to be in the stable? What was it like when you were on the run after Herod was trying to kill you and all the different places you went? He could have asked her all those stories and she could have told him. They would have talked about that. And so all of the other gospels tell those stories, but John doesn't. He doesn't talk about that when he begins his gospel. He was so close to Mary, and yet he still begins his gospel describing the character and who Jesus was. That's how important it is to him. See, it matters who's writing these stories and when they wrote it. Because here's what he says in John chapter 1, verse 4. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Now, you have to understand how huge this is that he says the life of men. The NIV version says all mankind. So we know that he's talking here about all men, not just Jewish men or whatever. He's talking about all people, men and women. And this is why it's so important and so huge. Because the Jews thought that when the Messiah came, they were going to fix all their political problems. People haven't changed, have they? Over the years. They're looking for somebody to come in and fix the political problems. And that's what they thought that Jesus was going to do. The Messiah was going to come in. He was going to restore power to Israel. They were become a world power again. They thought he was going to come and free them from slavery. He was going to take his rightful throne on the throne of David, and he was going to kick the Romans' butt right out of town. That's what they thought was going to happen. See, John was standing right in the room after the resurrection, if you remember this story. Jesus is standing there after he had died, after the resurrection, and they ask him, is now the time? Is now when you're going to restore the nation of Israel? Are you going to come now and set up your kingdom like we're all inside this little tiny room? You just came back from the dead. Rome is giving us a hard time, like let's go out there and do some stuff. And when is that going to happen? Is today the day? And then Jesus says to them, none of that is your business when that happens. It's not your business. What I want you to do is I want you to go into all nations and share the light that I have told you about. I want you to go and tell the entire world that the light has come. And we say this each week in our benediction. Go into all the world. Go into every nation. All ethnic groups, all countries, all over the world, all languages. Everybody needs to hear about this. So John, he's seen the destruction and he's seen the hatred that Rome has for the Jewish people. He's seen so many people die and be enslaved. And he still believes that Jesus came for those people, even the Romans. All nations. He believes that the light has come through Jesus. He is the light, not just for the Jews, but for all of us. Every nation, every tongue, every generation, thousands of years later, still. And then he says this. Because remember at the very book of John, it's like this is his intro. He's just beginning to talk about Jesus in his book. And he says this. John chapter 1, verse 5. The light shines in the darkness. And the darkness And then it's like he pauses for a second, like he's writing this down. What's the right word? The light shines in the darkness, and he thinks about the right word to say. And in spite of all that he has seen and all the darkness that he has seen, and in spite of the persecution, in spite of the crucifixion, in spite of the Jewish nation now being in slavery, in spite of the temple being burned to the ground, and in spite of everything he grew up with and loved is now being torn apart, in spite of so much darkness around him that has surrounded his life since he met this man Jesus, and in spite of all of that, he goes, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And this is the John, I want to remind you, who heard that Paul had been executed. He heard Peter had been killed, all the disciples have been murdered. John at this point, may very well be the last living apostle on planet Earth. This is the John who saw the darkness in the world try to blow out the light of Christ. He's seen darkness you can't imagine. He was there having breakfast with Jesus on the beach after the resurrection. This is the John who looked into the empty tomb and saw nobody in there that he saw the days before. And John has seen the darkness try and put out the light by killing his friends. And he says he couldn't put it out. Nero couldn't put it out. Caesar couldn't put it out. Pilate couldn't put it out. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ could not put this light out. He's seen all of this, and with a smile kind of on his face there writing this gospel, he says, the light shines in the darkness. And here I sit, and let me tell you, the darkness cannot overcome it. At Christmas, here's my deal for you this morning. When you have problems that you can't solve, when you have problems someone else is trying to fix, when you have problems you can't solve, or you are a problem that someone else is trying to fix, when you are confronted with people that you just can't control, no matter how many times you try to tell them, no matter how many times you tell them stories and help them understand your way, and they're not listening to you, they're not being very empathetic to others, and they just don't listen, and we can't control them. And then there's expectations that you're just not going to be able to meet at Christmas time. Or maybe you're setting expectations that other people can't meet at Christmas time. At Christmas, we were reminded that no matter how strong the darkness in our lives can be, that this is the truth of this child who has come, that Jesus is life, and a light that overwhelms the darkness in your life. And what it means for you is that there's always hope. There's always hope. John didn't sit there seeing all of this and say, I can't believe God would do all this. Oh my gosh, it's just terrible. I'm running away from God. I'm staying away from him. He didn't say that. He recognized he's still in control. I still see the light shining. I still believe that Jesus came to give life to these people. I still believe that the light shines in the darkness, and it will never, ever go out for eternity. There's always a chance. God hears our prayers, and he is there with you, he says, even until the end of the age. It's a promise. That's what Christmas is. So we say it's the most wonderful time of the year, not because of all the people around us and who's with us and what's happening, but it's who is for us and what happened at Christmas. So when you get into all the junk this Christmas, I hope you'll remember that and just have hope that the darkness cannot put out the light that has come. Let me pray for us.